If you get a house because of your job, so these are sometimes, if you read the cases, called tied houses, because the house depended on the job. The classic example is caretakers. Caretakers would very often have a house attached to it. When I was studying at UCL, our beadle, which was the old word for the security man, had a flat. And as long as he was the beadle, he had a flat in the building. As soon as the job ends, no longer a tenant. So you're not there as a tenant in your own right. You're there because of the job. So therefore you're not a tenant. You don't have a lease. So, are we okay so far with what we've done? How can a deed be consideration? Because it is consideration at common law. The deed has always been recognised as consideration at common law. So if you remember your contract, I can't remember the case in contract law. Pinnell's case, I think, talked about the performance of an existing contract is not good consideration unless you give something extra, which includes the deed. So it is defined in common law as consideration. What's going to come up in our problem question is the idea of exclusive possession when you have more than one potential tenant. So if you have more than one potential tenant, they have the additional burden of proving that they are joint tenants. A legal title to land can only be held as a joint tenant. A joint tenant with their co-joint tenants does not have a share, does not have a separate interest. The joint tenants are seen at law as one entity. So a little bit like the relationship with a company and its directors. The company is its own right. A joint tenant is a unit, is a legal entity. Legal title to land can only be held as a joint tenant. So if you're not a joint tenant, you can never have the legal title to land. To be a joint tenant, you must have the 4 unities. The case you could use for that, AG Securities and Vaughan. You must have together exclusive possession. You must have the possession of the property together. So as a unit, you can exclude everybody else. So we're going to look at some sham devices in a moment, but you have to, and it's very case heavy, and you must always apply it to the facts. Is there actually exclusive possession? So I might stay in a hotel and leave a note saying, do not make up my room. So I am effectively trying to exclude them. But they have a right. The fact that they don't come in doesn't mean that I have a right to exclude them. I've just asked them not to. I am generally just the licensee. But it could be that a landlord, and lots of these devices were used by landlords to avoid the regulations of the Rents Act. So they're being used to try and establish a licence because they do not want the obligations. Interest. The joint tenants do not have separate interests. A joint tenant owns 100%, and so does their co-joint tenants. There is no separate share. So again, this is based on the facts. If we have separate interests, this is going to be important, perhaps where the rent is going to be important. So in Mycover and Brady, 2 joint tenants, allegedly, they each had to pay a share of the rent. And when the young lady moved out, the man that was left said, I'll quite happily pay all of it. And the landlord said, no, because you're only liable for your half of the rent. Because you don't have, you and Mrs. Giles, I think, you do not have joint tenancies. You are tenants in common. That's Mykover and Brady. So liability for rent. So if you see in a problem question that two people signed two separate agreements where they both promised to pay £100, are they paying £50 each or £100 each? So is it £100 for the room, or is it £100 from A and £100 from B? Because that will determine whether they are joint tenants or tenants in common. Unity of interest. We both or all own 100%. Time. You must have the right to move in. You don't need to move in. You must have the right to move in and be obliged to move out at the same time. So I've seen in past exam questions where A will move in but B is on holiday. Well, as long as B has the right to move in, then they have the right, the unity of time. One of the problems in AG Securities and Vaughan is that people moved in and out of their houses at different times. Therefore, they didn't have the unity of time. Title. It must come from the same or an identical document. Antoniadis and Villiers. If you sign separate but identical documents, then you have unity of title. And it doesn't matter what that title says. If the title says it's a licence, it's irrelevant. So this is that move away from Somer and Hazelhurst. Street and Mountford, it's what it is. You can call a four-pronged instrument for digging the garden a spade. It's still a fork. So it's not what you've called it. Rose by any other name. It is what we, the court, say it is. Even if both parties think it's something else. So that's a clear example of moving away from contract to property. The courts will determine what it is, not what the parties determine what it is. So, in our problem questions, you have to decide whether the landlord has truly created a lease or a licence. It's the substance, not the form. So, a classic case. Antoniadis and Villiers and AG Securities. It's a joint hearing. So I don't know how many of you are reading the cases in primary source. It's a lot to do, I know. This is a case that's worth reading because you've got the two cases heard together. And you can see what the judges are doing. The law is exactly the same. The law doesn't change for either of these parties, but the results are substantially different. So in Antoniadis, it was a young, romantically linked couple moving in to a very small bedsit. And the landlord said he had the right to move somebody else in if he chose. A little bit like Aslan and Murphy as well. What were the chances of that actually happening? Was it a reality? Now they did have an area, a sofa that could turn into a bed settee. It was physically possible. In Aslan and Murphy, I would say that little tiny room, it was probably even physically impossible. But it was physically possible, but was it the intention really to actually move in? And the court said no, it wasn't, because they were a young couple. There's a double bed. The thought that they would happily let somebody else move into their home is a sham. It's not what they actually intended. You don't actually have to do it. It has to be your true intention. So the fact that you've never done it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It must be